Penn State in 2023 is a team I think you need to have your eye on. Just because something has not been doesn't mean it cannot be. And the reason I say that is because the iJosh will light up with buddies texting me before we go off the air. I promise you this will happen. And they'll say, you're wasting time talking about Penn State. Some form of everyone knows they can't win. They can't make the playoff. They can't win the Big Ten. They can't get past Ohio State and Michigan. Well, they haven't. Well, they actually have won the Big Ten. So you're talking about winning at the highest level of the sport. That's what you're saying they can't do. This is a wolf at the playoff door. That's what Penn State is. And Ohio State and Michigan have done a good enough job pushing their back against the door and keeping them out. They are, since 2015, they're 4-12 against those two teams. They're 44-12 against the rest of the Big Ten. So they've handled things okay. They're coming off a Rose Bowl trip. They're coming off a Rose Bowl victory. This team is a threat to make the playoffs this year. This team is a real threat to win the Big Ten this year, and it's not going to be a fizzle job. I really don't think this is a firecracker scenario where they better get it done in 2023. They are set up for a sustained run. These are some of my favorite stories in college football, the programs that build this way. In fact, a little bit later, Colin has a very helpful graphic for you. I know because I drew it myself. That's right. Authentic JP artwork will make its way onto the screen in a little while. So all of that said, what does this lead to? All this acquiring of talent, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but what does it lead to? Because right now, what I have is I got a bunch of people saying the exact same things they used to say about Kirby Smart. You just replace Nick Saban in Alabama with Ohio State or playoff. Like, well, Kirby can't win the big one. Kirby can't win the playoff. Kirby can't beat Saban. They can't beat Alabama. James Franklin he can't win the Big Ten and get to the playoff. Maybe he'll win it in a down year. Well, they can't beat Ohio State. They can't beat Michigan. Well, they have in years past, but your point is taken. They haven't regularly, which is a very hard thing to do, by the way, what you're demanding them do, but they've got a high standard. So I'm not going to fault you if you're a Penn State fan and you're diehard and you're fully bought in, you pay your season tickets and you invest in the program emotionally and financially. You should want a big return on that. James Franklin himself wouldn't push back on that. Penn State wouldn't push back on that. However high your standard is for them, this thing, I promise you, they got a higher standard for themselves than you do. What has to happen? Degrees of difference. That's what has to happen. They don't need the wholesale changes there either. They are right on the doorstep. If you're surprised in December, if they make the playoff, if you're surprised in December, it means I have failed you. It means I haven't done my job. No one should be surprised if this team pops this fall, and no one should be surprised if Penn State goes on a multi-year run here where they're in the conversation every year that you haven't had them in years past. They've got Drew Aller. That's a name that Jesse bows his head before he even utters in the office right now. That is the best quarterback prospect they've brought in there under Franklin. But this is not going to be a guy who has to shoulder an ultra-heavy load. They got two excellent running backs up there. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about Penn State being void of a legitimate run game. It is a sigh of relief breathed across the Keystone State. They don't have to talk like that anymore. They've got a ton of proven production on the offensive line coming back. Defense returns 75% of its production. Abdul Carter is a name that they know, that the rest of the country will know this year. Linebacker depth is good. Jurisic, offensive coordinator, back. Manny Diaz was one of the sneakiest, best pickups last year by James Franklin at defensive coordinator, and he's back. Now, I want you to think about this. If I were advising Manny Diaz, brutally honest here, he gets fired from Miami. I didn't like necessarily the way they handled his exit down there. I would have told him take a year off. In fact, I talked to head coaches about this. It probably would shock you to know that head coaches will reach out sometimes because a lot of them think about getting in media. And so they'll do their due diligence. I've talked to two of them recently, and they've asked, hey, what do you think? Sounding board, what do you think? Should I go the media route? Should I go take a coordinator job? Should I get right back into it and take a lower-level head coaching job? I always tell them, no one's stock lowers by being on TV for a year. Dan Mullen is writing the book on this right now. He's putting on a clinic. Mac Brown put on a clinic. It's like they get 5% better. Think about John Gruden once upon a time. John Gruden got to the point where every job opening, college and NFL, began with the name John Gruden. So I thought Manny Diaz should have gone and sat in a TV studio for a year. He didn't. He got right back in it, and he went to Penn State, and they were a good product last year. I think they'll be a great product defensively this year. 4 of their top 5 sack leaders are back. The reason I'm giving you these bullet points is to, again, emphasize there should be no surprise if this team is good this year. Should be no surprise at all. I have been wearing this plain white t-shirt for years in preparation for this moment where I look like the guy who was ahead of the curve on Penn State. I am also very cheap, but I want that to be forgotten. I want that to be in the background. In the foreground, when you think of this white tee, think of whiteout. What's the whiteout game this year, Jesse? I'm looking at the schedule right now. Probably the Michigan game. Yeah, so look, I love Big Noon Kickoff. It's not my network. I don't work for Fox, but I love Big Noon Kickoff. Everyone in the Big Ten hates it, especially everyone at Penn State hates it, and I understand why. But sometimes the fine folks there cost Penn State one of those nighttime spectacles. And you're looking at the schedule right now. It could be Iowa early in the year. Could be Michigan later in the year. Probably not going to be Indiana, but we'll see. Doesn't the Big Ten have a weird clause about night games late in the year? I don't know. Anyway, that's on down the road. I don't care if they play in the parking lot at 9 a.m. I'm telling you Penn State's going to be really good this year. Success is not always linear. This is where my artwork comes in. Colin, roll the artwork, because I worked long and hard on this. Immunity. If you're listening on podcasts, this means nothing to you. Just please bear with me. Everyone wants success to be linear. Everyone wants you to win 5 games one year, 7 games the next year, 9 games, 11 games, conference title, national title. It's just supposed to work that way. And sometimes things don't take off right out of the gate. Sometimes there's a slow build. The reason I'm familiar with the trajectory of the black line on the chart you're watching right now is because it's the way my career went. And I watched a lot of folks who claim to love the same things I love, and they went about it, or they went into the same profession I did, and they took off and left me in the dust. Or so it seemed. This sounds really braggadocious, but I don't mean it to sound this way. I just mean it matter-of-factly. Sometimes the guy or the team or the company that doesn't always set the world on fire out of the gate is still doing things the right way. It just, for whatever reason, there's a unique confluence of circumstances that mean they don't just mushroom cloud immediately. Some folks do. That's great. I'll tell you what else happens, though. Sometimes folks' progress is linear, and they're just not moving at the trajectory that's going to match you when you finally do blow up. Now, here's what hasn't happened yet. You see that curve? See that really violent curve and that spike there on the black line on the chart on your screen? We may be at the curve point for Penn State. You may be at the point where everything finally comes together. And they've got a dynamite run game to go along with one of the best quarterbacks in their conference, to go along with defensive depth and quality of frontline player, the likes of which they haven't all put together in the James Franklin era. And here we are nearly a decade into his tenure there. And sure enough, you mark my words, if Penn State's a playoff team this year, if Penn State's in the playoff picture every year for the next 3 or 4 years, people are going to say, wow, Penn State kind of came out of nowhere. They didn't come out of nowhere any more than that apple tree comes out of nowhere. You don't plant the seed and then get the harvest the next day. I know it seems that way with some programs, but not every one of them happens the way Kirby happened at Georgia. Not every one of them can happen the way that Saban turned Alabama around overnight. The stories I love are the ones where folks just keep stacking good days on top of each other. They've got a process. They don't radically redefine it. Clemson under Dabo Swinney was this way. Everyone knows Clemson is a program that took down Bama a couple of times, won multiple titles. You go research their first 4 or 5 years. It was not what Clemson ended up being. And I think we may be singing a similar song. Well, maybe some of you will. I'm already singing a different song. I think maybe people will sing a different song about Penn State over the coming years than they have so far. I just don't want you to be surprised. That's all I'm saying.